Well, now we'll have another invited talk by Antonios Anastasopoulos. And well, while I was studying in my master's, I've been hugely impressed by the joint work of Antonios and colleagues. Over the sigmorphon task on morphological inflection, they had shown that the attention maps could be morphologically motivated, and I got so impressed that I ended up doing probing as a hobby and looking into attention maps for several next years. Antonios has experience in endangered languages as well. He not only is a specialist on SOTA technologies, but has worked documenting Greco, and his PhD dissertation was on computational tools for endangered languages documentation. So now his talk named Jointly Building Corpora and Morphosyntactic Analysis Tools. Yeah, please, you're welcome to share your expertise and your,
Will do. Thank you, Oleg. Hi, everyone. And sorry for being a little flustered. I was locked out of my house until about 2 minutes ago. So, but I managed to get in. So give me just a second to play my slides in a window, and then I'll share that window. And that way I can see you too. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So can you guys see my screen? All
yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I thought I would talk about jointly building corpora and morphosyntactic analysis, but then I thought again, and I decided to just talk a little bit about two, and if we have time, 3 different case studies with in the field, basically, or basically my experience with working with some communities and the work that we did with them. I think it would be a bit more interesting than just talking just about models or whatever. So yeah, so as Oleg said, I'm Adonis. I'm an assistant professor at George Mason University in computer science. I wish I was a linguist. I have been involved with some documentation efforts in Europe, and I'll talk a bit about these. But yeah, so basically what I want to talk about today is these 3 case studies related to 3 communities that in work that I have done before. And I would please encourage you, if anything, since I know it's not like, we have 100 people here, there's 15 people on Zoom and maybe another 10 or so in person. So I think it would be much more interesting if you just interrupt me whenever you want. I'll try to monitor the chat, and I'll also try to, just monitor, just raise your hand or whatever if you're on Zoom. Okay, so I think it'll be better if we make it interactive. So yeah, so let me just get started with right away with the first case study and this work that we did on building educational tools for Mapudungun. So basically, what is Mapudungun? Mapudungun is the language of the Mapuche people. So it is an indigenous Latin American language. It's spoken by about 150,000 speakers in Chile and Argentina. You can see here a map seen from the perspective of the Mapuche people. So you see the mountains, that's the Andes, and that's the traditional area here where it's Chile in front and then Argentina in the back. Now, even though there's about 1 million or 2 million ethnic Mapuche people, only about 150,000 still speak the language. And it is threatened. It is only spoken in some social domains, especially as young people move to the big cities in Chile and they all switch to Spanish. So it is threatened, and it is in need of support for revitalization efforts. So a bit on the language characteristics of Mapudungun. It's a language isolate, so it doesn't have any surviving other languages that are related to it at this point. Right now, there exist 3 competing orthographies for that language. They're all used interchangeably depending on which area of the Mapuche land you come from. And I'm showing you here an example. There's the Ragileo orthography, where the word for Yampuscan, which actually means butterfly, is written with you see the J and the V, whereas in the Azumchefe orthography, the Y sound is made with like the double L, kind of like in Spanish. And then there's the U with the umlaut there, and so on. And there's the Unificado, their third orthography. And all of these are concurrently used. You'll find some material, for example, in some magazines are in Ragileo, some other magazines are in Azumchefe, and so on. So that's an interesting thing. And the language is polysynthetic, which basically means that it has very, very rich orthography, very rich morphology, sorry. So I'm showing you here an example of essentially a sentence that says we are indeed going to learn the Mapuche language, and you'll see why we're looking at this sentence. And you'll notice how this really long word thing, which, you know, coming from Europe, you define this Mapuzuguye Kume Yain as a word, in fact, should be segmented to a bunch of these morphemes, Mapu, Zugu, Yeku, Me, and so on, that all have carry some grammatical meaning. So hence the difficulty of the language. And in educational settings, which is where we actually, what I'm going to get into, that's what learners need help with. Because for any given long word like this, there can be multiple possible segmentations that could be valid. And that's true for many other polysynthetic languages, not specific to Mapudungun. So what we wanted to do, and by we, I basically mean Christian, the first author of this paper, who was this amazing guy who's Mapuche himself. He is a computer science master student, but also an instructor of the language. So the combination of the three basically showed Christian how, basically he saw how we could potentially augment his teaching of the language using NLP. And that's what we tried to do. And the idea was the following, to initially just try to help learners by showing them the different segmentations, because that's really the thing that Christian said that they were struggling with. So let's say you have this phrase that will be your input. The first thing that we will need to do is detect which orthography of the three competing orthographies your input is in, so that we can either transliterate it into the other one, which is easy to do, so that we can work with our NLP tools, or just be able to tell the learner, hey, this document that you have is in this particular orthography, so you might want to use these tools. Then the next thing that we wanted to do is analyze, segment these long words, and crucially, not just segment them, but also present them to people, to learners of the language in a way that it will be helpful for them. So we cannot just assume that the segmentation where we tag things with, you know, this is negation, this is a first person singular morpheme, that this is something that someone who's not a linguist will not necessarily understand, especially as we, you know, in linguistics, you're going to see a lot of in-domain terminology that lay people won't necessarily understand. So a lot of the work came into this translation of linguistics terminology into plain language for the students. And then you have to present the output again in a meaningful format. So if you think of this pipeline that we are trying to build, given the input, the orthography detection, we realized that we could do this fairly easily with simple rules, and basically write a bunch of regular expressions to convert one into the other without any loss of information or any problems. So we did that. So there was no need, for example, to train a machine learning model when we could write a simple Python function that did the work that we wanted to do. So there's that. This is easy to handle. It was some engineering work, but it's done. The morphological analysis and the segmentation, we relied on existing FST-based grammars that a linguist had built when they studied the language. And they have a very broad coverage of like 97 or 98% with fairly good accuracy, to be frank. So again, we had some existing linguistics work, but again, the problem was making it useful for in-classroom instruction. So, and that's where this informal translation comes into. So let me just show you an example of that, what this looks like. Let's say we have this word, okay? And imagine you're a learner of Mapazungun, okay? You're given this word, maybe you recognize a bunch of morphemes, maybe not. And you're trying to figure out what this thing means, right? The morphological system, the segmentation system will give you something like this, right? It will give you the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different morphemes that you could segment this long word into. And then it will also give you this translation of each of them. So, for example, this first morpheme, we have translated it as the verb caminar or marchar in Spanish, or, you know, to walk or to take a walk. And you'll notice that all of our informal translations of all of these are in Spanish, exactly because that's the other language that Mapuche people are the colonial language in the region where they are forced to operate in. So the second morpheme is again translated as to go, andar. Que is a morpheme that denotes something that happens habitually. So we translated it in Spanish as habitualmente, right? Then we have this morpheme that actually indicates negation. And then the last one is he or she, okay, like the third person singular. But rather than saying third person singular, we translate it as he or she, or él or ella in Spanish. So now, given that, we are hoping that the learner will be able to tell, and maybe you might want to try to, by looking at these morphemes, to gauge what this word means. If you were to translate it as a phrase in English, we are hoping that they would be able to translate this into this, right? That he or she does not usually go for walks. And by showing all of these, we're hoping that the learner will learn, A, to recognize morphemes, B, to learn what these morphemes mean, and third, how they are composed to produce the intended meaning. So we have this pipeline, and now we also deployed it in an interface. So this is a screenshot from the interface. That the interface is also available online. I don't have a link in the slides, but you can find it in the paper. Where, let's say, someone typed this this work, Perum Paya Fuyu, Pemur Parafuyu. I always skip a syllable. Ignore this. So there's this word, and they typed it in. The tool recognized that this is in the Azum Chefe orthography, as you see in the second line there. And then the tool will show to the user the different possible segmentations. And you'll notice that in this example, there's 2 different possible segmentations that are not necessarily leading to something very different, if you notice the difference. Oh no, they are, yeah, but conceptually they're very, very similar. And then they can see what, you know, the different morphemes mean in Spanish, right? So pe is the verb. It's a transitive verb that means to see or to encounter. The second morpheme mu has to do with actions of someone that is you, like a second person singular, or me, and so on. So given all of these, this is what the learners see, and that's the tool that we deployed in a classroom. So showing this to the classroom and to a bunch of people that are learning, what we did this usability study. We're like, hey, take these words and try to tell us if you can use the tool to see if you can tell what they mean, or if you can, you know, in the end, after you use this tool for a while, tell us if you feel like you have a better understanding of the morphemes and the segmentation and how these things are composed to produce meaning. So Christian handled all of these as part of his teaching of the language. And I'm only going to give you very briefly the findings of this study, and you can find a lot of the details in the paper. So what we found was that this tool was particularly helpful for intermediate learners of the language. So not ones that are very early and they're still trying to figure out how the language works or still learning basic vocabulary, because that analysis was already too complicated for early learners. And the native speakers, of course, they really liked what we were doing. They were excited to even have some technology or some online tool in Mapazungun, but they didn't really have a real need for it, because given context, they were able to understand everything to begin with. Although they did say in some of the qualitative comments that we asked for, they did say that it was super exciting. It was very interesting that they were able to see also different possible segmentations that they might not have thought of, given the different contexts, and so on. So yeah, so that's the first case study where I want to highlight a couple of things. The first is the interaction between the learners and the teacher, and both of them being essentially members of the community, and how we were able to take something that a linguist had done as part of their PhD dissertation, an FST grammar that was sitting at some server in Barcelona for a few years, and put in the hands of the people, again, only because Christian, the teacher of the language, the instructor of the language, was able to recognize that here's the problem, here's a potential solution, and we're able to deploy it. And this is currently used for teaching Mapazungun in the University of Chile. So hold that thought so far for now for this first case study. I know I kind of like jumped straight into this, but I'm gonna stop here in case there's any questions before I go to the next one. Yes, Kat.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really interesting. So I was wondering, so who then assesses those sentences? So when you provide those words and then ask them to provide the segmentations and interpretations, and then those learners produce certain sentences either in English or Spanish, probably in Spanish.
In Spanish.
So who is then assessing this, and whether you have a corpus, for instance, of those?
So yeah,
whether you collected any corpus on this?
Yeah, so we do have a corpus for Mapazungun. The interesting thing is that Christian, being an instructor of the language, already was doing exercises like this with his students. So he was giving them these words, and he was like, okay, now produce the segmentation and try to figure out what the meaning is based on everything you have learned so far. So Christian, the first author of the study, and the native, the instructor of the language, was the one who then assessed the outputs that his students were giving him with and without the tool. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's a bit, I guess, a little biased, given that he's also the author of the study and the person doing the evaluation. But in the end, what we did see was that the most important thing was that for the intermediate learners, which is actually the people that needed help with these particular tasks, having access to the tool, they were able to produce essentially good segmentations. They were able to figure out exactly what this long word meant, and so on. So the study was very small scale, as part of like one semester of teaching the language in one classroom. Well, no, actually multiple classrooms, because they had the early learners and the intermediate and the native speakers that Christian reached out to. But in the end, it was, I think, a few dozen. It wasn't like more than like 20-30 people, if I recall correctly, who actually tried to use the tool. I didn't mention, and then I'm going to go to the question that we seem to have there in person, that initially when we tried to reach out to people, we sent invitations to about 200 to 250 people, and we didn't hear back, exactly because people were suspicious of Christian for working with the gringos, with the white people, on doing stuff in Mapazungun. It was only after his students, who were, the people were trying to connect with their language, reached out to their family members and all that, were able to get a lot of responses for our studies. Anyway, that's a side note on the challenges of working with these languages that have a very difficult colonial past. Did I answer your question, Kat?
Yeah, so it's just one thought that I had previously based on Stephen's works as well. Like maybe David can comment about this, like whether we can use unimorph for some educational purposes like that as well. So I
have thought about this. Yes. So yeah. Is there let me go. We will go back to this because I've been thinking about this
okay.
for a while. What's the question from the room? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation so far. In your slide, you say that native speakers like it but have no real need for it. But there's like a tiny group of native speakers who does, which are people who are language teachers or are training to be language teachers. These are the native speakers who actually need to know things like what's a noun, what's a morpheme, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some success in testing tools like part-of-speech taggers with people who are taking like intro to the teaching of the indigenous language. I was wondering if you had any response from people who were like this, like training to go teach Mapudungun in high schools, in grammar schools. And maybe this is a way that this could be tested with a community of native speakers who actually care about a morpheme.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, I don't think we talked to other teachers other than the scholars other than the professors at the University of Chile that are professors of indigenous studies there, who were in Christian's master's committee, who thought that his work was excellent. But you're absolutely right that that's a really good idea. We're still working. I'm still in contact with Christian at the University of Chile, so reaching out. So as far as I know, he was the only language teacher at the time at the university, but I wouldn't be surprised if he knew other teachers or potential teachers or instructors of the language that we could reach out to. So that's actually a good idea. Yeah, and you're absolutely right.
Thank you.
I guess what I mean by they don't have no real need for it is that after we had them use the tool for the particular words for the same study as all the other learners, they didn't learn anything new.
Yeah.
Other than seeing some of the additional potential segmentations that were like, oh, okay, yeah, you could segment like this, but it's like a little weird or whatever. It's not that so that it wasn't. I mean, we have in the paper in an appendix with all of the comments for the qualitative ones where they're like, it's amazing work. They're like, I can't believe something like this exists for Mapazungun and so on. So I was really proud of it. Honestly, there's very little state of the art or whatever NLP in this, but that's the work that I'm most proud of from the past 1 or 2 years, because we're able to put in the classroom. And I forgot to say, and I don't have it in the slide, that we do have the whole interface and the backend all open sourced. So in theory, if someone had a similar FST for another indigenous language, or if they needed to do transliteration or whatever, they could pull up our code and then do the necessary modifications for that particular language and deploy a similar system for another language. All right, so then let me move on to the next case study, which is also the one that touches a bit on the jointly building corpora and morphosyntactic analysis and kind of like how these can work together. So POMAC, different language, different environment, different continent. POMAC is spoken by about 500,000 speakers, scattered in the borders of Bulgaria and Greece and Turkey. Most of them are in Bulgaria and Greece. And the POMAC people have traditionally been very isolated from the rest. They used to be the Muslims, the Muslim Bulgarians, when all the population exchanges happened in the Balkans. So there's also a lot of animosity with other people and so on and so forth. Right now, the language is not exactly endangered. It's still spoken up in the mountains of Rhodope between Bulgaria and Greece, but it is threatened in the sense that it is either only used in the household, because in the marketplace, people will use either Bulgarian or Greek, depending on what side of the border they're on, or in very specialized domains. So the language is an East-South Slavic languages. It's super interesting because it has almost equal amount of influences from both medieval Greek and from Turkish. Turkish because of the religion, medieval Greek because of the general region where they lived. And kind of like as before, there still exist three competing orthographies, one in Cyrillic, mostly used on the Bulgarian side of the border, one in Greek, mostly used in the Greek side of the border. There's also a Latin orthography that tries to be a bit more neutral between the two. And interestingly, none are widely accepted. So, and then another important thing is that there's no formal language instruction, as in there's no textbook as of now. When the community tries to teach the language, it's always in an organic fashion. But what we are working towards in this project with linguists in Greece and with members of the community, again, on the Greek side of the border, with the Poma community over there, is to create a formal curriculum that they can use to teach the language, so that they can also use it in schools, and get a bit more organized in their efforts to preserve the language. So the first thing we did was, with the help of the community, gather everything that we could find so that we could compile a corpus. So we got folk tales from different villages, which leads to some dialectal variation. We got any data we could find from linguistics papers that had focused on Pomak before. We got some data from journalists or from other people who had translated stuff into Pomak. And then we also had some collections of folk songs and proverbs and so on and so forth. So overall, we have now a decent sized corpus that we can use to do very interesting things. The first challenge that we had to solve was to try to convert everything into one orthography, because all of these things coming from different places, also different time, right? Some of the data might have been periodicals from the 50s, for example. They all were in, some in Cyrillic, some in Latin, some in Greek. It was a big mess. So we worked with the community to convert everything into one alphabet that we could work with. So we had to solve a bunch of, basically to choose one orthography for the language. And the choice between the Cyrillic or the Greek or the Latin alphabet is largely a political one, especially between the Cyrillic and the Greek one. And what they leaned towards was just the Latin approach. So we stuck with the Latin alphabet, but there were some additional criteria that we needed to take into account when choosing exactly what the alphabet should be, at least for this particular corpus. The first criterion was phonetic transparency. That means that we needed words that make up phonetic minimal pairs. We wanted them to also look different when written down. So I have here a few examples. You can see the word palata, that means floor, or the word, oops, sorry, I clicked on something. Palta, that means doused. There was a version of an orthography that didn't distinguish the two. Or you can see that in the second row, Sicom versus Chicom. Again, the only difference is the first letter. We wanted this to be distinguishable in the orthography, and you see a bunch of other examples further down. So the next thing is that we wanted the orthography to avoid showing pronunciation changes due to context, and I'll show you what I mean. We wanted essentially and let me backtrack here. Pomak being a Slavic language, it also has rich morphology. There's lots of verb inflections, there's lots of noun inflections, and so on. So we wanted the lemmas or the roots of the words to not change in the orthography. Let me give you an example. B or D, the sounds B or D are devoiced when they're in word final position. So for example, the word for verb, chleb, okay? I'm showing you here on the left the orthography that we ended up with. That B there at the first word is actually pronounced as a P, right? It's devoiced. Whereas when you talk about of the verb, then you have chlebu. So it's a B. Or when you pluralize and you have the nominative plural form of the same noun, then you pronounce it as chlbove, right? So again, it's a B as opposed to a P. So there were some orthographies that would have written the first word as HL, AE, and then P, because that's how it was pronounced. But then you lost kind of like the similarity between all of the different forms of the word. So that's another criteria in making up the orthography. Then the next thing that we had to solve had to do with exactly how we're gonna write down all the sounds. And we wanted to opt with easily discriminable symbols. So for example, and we wanted this to be consistent. So let me give you an example. In Pomak, in the alphabet that we settled on with the community, all palato-alveolar sibilants are all denoted with a hat check. And all palatalized sonors are denoted with a cedilla, right? The little like comma-like thing that you use that's also, for example, in Portuguese. So contrast this, for example, in Slovak, where the y and y sounds are in Slovak written with denoted with two different things, right? In Slovak, you have L and sound like an apostrophe, or the N with a hat check. So these are two different, so it's the same phenomenon, but denoted with two different symbols. Whereas in Croatian, they are denoted with the same symbol, LJ and NJ, but that requires two graphemes and it overloads J and so on. So we ended up just using the hat check. Again, this is just an example of the decisions that we had to make when making the alphabet. Of course, we also wanted this to be easily deployable in any device, so it had to be a Unicode orthography. And then we also had to deal a bit with word segmentation, exactly because the language is not standardized. There's cases like in other Slavic languages, if I'm not super mistaken, where you might have the word meaning since at kak, and you have to decide whether you're going to write it as one word or you're going to segment it into at and kak into the basically two morphemes that make it up, or the same with this other second word that I'm showing you here. We opted for the second option. Again, this was after about, I want to say, like 2 months of discussions with the community and with the linguists, so that, you know, that was I don't say dark times. It was very, very, very interesting work. But now that we're settled on the alphabet and the orthography that we want to use, we were able then with a lot of, again, handcrafted rules to go through every possible source of the data that we had, identify what were the changes that we had to make, and write code to do this automatically. And now, another thing that we found was this existing lexicon, and that kind of brings me to how we were going to use this. So this lexicon, called the Rodopsky dictionary, right? The Rodopsky is the mountain range where the Pomak people live. Was compiled by someone, Ridvan, the first author of the paper that you saw before. And this guy is not a linguist, he's not a computer scientist, and yet he spent 25 years collecting data, creating essentially that dictionary that you see here, an online interface for accessing it, where you can look up a word or a lemma, a form or a lemma, and then it will show translations, it will show different forms, It will show in Greek. It's not exactly clear here, but it also shows in Greek it has morphological tags for the inflection and the paradigm and so on. And it also has examples and so on and so forth. So we took this dictionary, and by doing the appropriate changes into the orthography, by translating all of the lexicographical information into morphological tags, we were able to convert essentially that dictionary into a huge 3.5 million entries unimorph list for POMAC. So, it only covers 61,000 lemmas, but in the end, that covers almost 90-something% of the data that we were able to collect. So essentially what we have now is we have the corpus that we have collected. Now we have potentially the morphological information that we can get from the lexicon by just looking it up. Of course, there's potential ambiguities there that will need to be resolved, but that's a lot more manageable than trying to annotate things from scratch. I forgot to mention that in the process of making an educational resource, we decided to, after we have the corpus, to try and build parse-speech taggers and morphological analyzers and syntactic parsers all under the the universal dependencies formalism, so that we can also put these tools in the hands of the users as we also, the team builds the resources for the instruction. So here's our process. First, basically what we try to do first is train models that will be able to produce the correct morphological annotation for our corpus now. So we first learned static embeddings over our corpus, which is something you can do. We have almost enough data to learn decent embeddings, right? Say with fast text or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Then we will do lookups on the dictionary and correct for a very small seed corpus, show it to the linguists or to the native speakers, or to the linguist native speakers that are part of the team, and they will correct the annotation so that they will resolve the ambiguities. Or if we have an out of vocabulary word, they will produce the morphological tagging. And that took about 30 days to create a small seed corpus of about 2,000 sentences. Okay, it's not, I guess it's not small in a traditional sense. It did take us about 30 days of work to actually do this. But when we have this now, we can just train a model, say using a popular toolkit like Stanza, to annotate the rest of our corpus. And given that we have lemmatization information, we have parse-speech tagging information, we have morphological feature tagging information based off of the lexicon that we converted, we were able to right away, and these are numbers that I'm showing you here on a test set that we held apart, to get really good numbers on lemmatization, on parse-speech tagging, and on doing the morphological feature tagging, all above 95% in accuracy. So basically that means that with a little bit of work and using, again, what the community produced, or let's say what Ridvan, to be honest, produced in the form of that lexicon, we're able to now build models that now we can annotate with fairly high, very, very high accuracies all of our corpus, so that then people can search for it, they can do syntactic search, they can search for phrases that have a specific structure in terms of like their parse-speech tags and so on and so forth. The next step has to do with now producing a syntax and syntactic parser for the corpus. So again, we want to operate within the UD, the Universal Dependencies Formalism. And the process is, again, we're going to annotate by hand a small seed corpus with syntax trees. Now, small is not thousands of sentences, just 100-ish sentences. And what we're going to do now is we're going to compare a couple of models. First, we're going to train a model completely from scratch, where we're going to try to train a model that will predict the morphology and the syntax. Or we can now use our whole corpus that we have potentially annotated, even if it's potentially wrong, right? Because, you know, we only have like 95, 97% accuracy. And pre-train a model that will train it to do the morphological tagging and the part of speech tagging and the lemmatization on the same corpus that we're trying to do syntax on. And then we're going to fine tune on that model then on just these 100 sentences that we have for training our parser. And if you do this, you end up with a much, much better parser. You'll notice here that the first model gets an unlabeled attachment score of like 68, a labeled attachment score of around 50. The second model gets labeled and unlabeled attachment scores in the upper 70s. Still not super great, but keep in mind we only have 100 sentences so far. And notice you might be thinking, well, there's some stuff missing here, right? How about using related languages? How about transferring from other related languages? POMAC, for example, has been considered for decades a dialect of Bulgarian for political reasons, to be completely honest with you. Could we transfer, say, from Bulgarian and do better for POMAC? So what we need to do is compare a model trained only on POMAC, the one that I just showed you before, or a model that is perhaps pre-trained on Bulgarian and then fine-tuned on POMAC. Or why should we just commit ourselves just to Bulgarian? Maybe we can pre-train on many Slavic languages, perhaps South Slavic languages, or, you know, don't include necessarily Russian or Polish or whatever. But if you keep the South Slavic ones like Serbian, Croatian, and so on, Bulgarian, and then fine-tune on POMAC. Or you could also say, well, you could take the South Slavic model, fine-tune it on Bulgarian, then fine-tune it on POMAC or whatever. So we are still doing this. So I hope to have concrete results to show you. But based on the initial results that we have here, it does seem that B, basically pre-training on Bulgarian and then fine-tuning on POMAC, is going to be a little bit better, not necessarily enough for the pain of doing this than A, and A is better than C. So it doesn't look like a multilingual approach is necessarily going to be much better, at least in this case. And it might have to be with the fact that POMAC has a, you know, it's not your traditional East Slavic language. It has influences from both Greek and Turkish and so on. So maybe biasing the model too much towards Slavic languages is not ideal in this particular case. So we are still working on this. This is still ongoing. We have about 2 more years left in this project, and there's still a lot of work to do. So first, we want to expand our annotations, and we're already thinking about things like bootstrapping. So now that we have a parser, can we expedite our annotation process by showing the outputs of the syntactic parser to our annotators to correct, as opposed to having them produce syntax trees from scratch? Or what if we did active learning, as in we have now our parser tell us which sentences we should try to annotate. Another thing that we haven't looked into, but is super interesting to try and do, is to utilize some of the parallel data that we have. So some of the corpus that we built came with translations either from Bulgarian or from Greek, or from Turkish, actually. So what if we were able to do label transfer from all of these languages that we know how to parse or how to annotate? And then if at some point we have enough parallel data, maybe we could also build translation systems as opposed to just syntactic and morphosyntactic analysis. And then the next thing is, at the very end, we will need to go back and document and potentially handle with our models all the different dialectal variations that we already are observing in our corpus. Having data from more than 8 villages, if I'm correct, that are all scattered in, throughout the mountains, we're already observing significant differences even in syntactic and morphosyntactic phenomena, not just phonology, which is the most common one. So we'll need to document these and do a serious study on how we can have our models handle this. So to summarize this, and I'll open it up for questions for anyone who's interested. Again, I wanted to highlight how by working with the community, we were able to find all of the sources of, I think many sources of the data that then we digitized and made machine readable. B, we were able to get in contact with this guy that had built this lexicon that we were able to immediately essentially produce resources for POMAC to do morphological analysis, which is amazing. And C, I also wanted to share the painful process of standardization that we had to go through with the community in order to produce the alphabet that now everything will be produced into. So I'll wait a little bit for questions if there's any, and if not, I will very quickly. I have like 5 more minutes or something, right? Or should I be try to wrap up?
I just have a couple of small questions. First, given this orthography thing, like you say that there is no accepted orthography, do speakers use POMAC somewhere in the web? Because, well, in such cases, a sort of orthography appears, like they end up inserting commas or dots in the middle of words, or using apostrophes as alternative to CTs or adjectives. So was there such a case?
So yeah, so there's very, very few web pages in POMAC. One of them is the dictionary that I showed you, but it really matters on where you live. So for example, POMACs on the Greek side of the border, they were often writing POMAC. I can recall 1 or 2 web pages that were using the Greek alphabet, or a couple of textbooks from the 60s that used the Greek alphabet, or they used the Latin alphabet. Folks on the Bulgarian side of the border, they use the Cyrillic alphabet. And I think there's a couple of web pages or a couple of magazines written in POMAC in the Cyrillic alphabet. Some religious texts that were translated from Turkish use the Latin alphabet, like Turkish did. So yeah, it's a big mess. So that's the thing. And what I meant by that, there's no widely accepted orthography, that even on the web, you can find all 3 of them.
Okay.
So given that this effort now is done by mostly Greek linguists working with the POMAC folks on the Greek side of the border, we are working with the institutions that the community has there, so that will become the standardized version, at least for the, I hope, the Greek side of the border at a minimum. But having that new alphabet be the product and disseminated from the, say, what's the proper name? The institution for the culture, it's the cultural institution for the POMAC languages, or something like this. I can find it if you're interested. I hope that this will eventually make whatever they produce the de facto standard for anything produced going forward. Especially if that's the thing that they teach to the kids. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Antonis. Is there time for a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is mostly a comment, but also a little bit of a question. So this is fantastic and super interesting. What you're doing now reminds me very much of the work that went on in Alaska mostly in the 60s and 70s, in terms of standardizing orthographies, choosing orthographic systems, et cetera. And the language that I work with also has the Cyrillic versus Latin issue on the Russian and American sides. I wanted to make a comment based on one of the particular choices that you made that is exactly the same as what was the choices that were made, exactly mirrored the choices that were made for a couple of different Alaskan languages, again in the 60s and 70s during the orthography, when you were talking about the word final devoicing, and making it right, the B, and making the choice of going with the orthography that makes sense for the native speakers. So the native speakers will know to devoice that at the end of the word. I'm guessing that was part of the rationale for going through that. The situation that has come about in Alaska with almost exact, I mean, it's not word final devoicing, but it's the same principle, making the choices that for the orthography that made sense to the native speakers. 40, 50 years later, in a situation where there aren't as many native speakers, this has turned out to be a problem for learners, because learners then look at the equivalent of your situation and pronounce it like a B when they're learning it, because it looks like a B. And so in the communities that I'm working with, there's a little bit of questioning going on as to whether or not that was the right choice, because although it was definitely the right choice at the time, if you get to a situation where there's not very many fluent speakers and people are using this orthography primarily to learn, that can be problematic for the learners. I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad choice, but I'm showing you, like, in this situation, what happened like 50 years later.
Yeah, so that's super good to know. I'm wondering, there have to be similar stories from across the world, right? So I think, the choice of, the whole problem of choosing an orthography for a community is just insanely hard, right? You've seen some communities in Africa, for example, decide, or even in Canada, decide to go with something completely different than what the colonialists used, right? So they come up with their own alphabet, or not alphabet, their own writing system to denote, that it's a different thing, it's a different language, and so on and so forth. So that's fair, right? Sometimes, people would, some like us will say, oh no, why are you doing this? I cannot do cross-lingual transfer now because now my embeddings look different, right? But I think they're all valid choices, but I think it would be really good to have these stories like the one you just shared somehow documented or written down, so that maybe we can.
I mean, that particular story, I did a little write-up in LD&C. The way we ended up resolving that was we built a little web tool that could make the orthography fully transparent, so that language teachers could use it in the classroom. Essentially showing the version that ends in a P to the language learners in the classroom.
Right. Interesting. Okay, I will definitely keep that in mind, and I might reach back out to you. I don't think we are gonna go back and try to change the orthography at this point.
No, I wasn't suggesting that you do. It was just an issue to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's absolutely good to know. So how much time do I have?
Well, I believe we have 8 minutes. I mean, initially we've been dedicating this last 10 minutes to questions, but as we ask questions intermediately, we could use these 8 minutes.
Okay, yeah, so I can be very quick. The other case study is a little older, and it's for a language close to my heart, Greco. So Greco is a variety of Italian Greek. It's spoken in South Italy. It is very, very endangered. It has less than 20,000 speakers, and it's a super interesting language. It is a variety of Greek that is basically medieval Greek, because there were people transplanted in the medieval times from the Balkans there. It has influences both from Italian and from the local Romance vernacular, which is Salentino in this case. So there's a situation of triglossia at this point between what, and where all of these 3 languages are used in different domains. So it's just super, super interesting. At some point, we were able to collect a corpus for the language, basically digitize a corpus. That corpus had been collected essentially almost a century ago by this ethnographer who documented the Greco community. And it also had translations in Italian. So the fact that we had translations in Italian allowed us to basically bootstrap a very good power-of-speech tagger real quick. So basically, we were able to use cross-lingual projections for the tags. Basically, you can see an example here where the top sentence is a Greco sentence, the bottom sentence is the same sentence in Italian. We can easily do power-of-speech tagging in Italian. We can then follow the word-level alignments, and whenever we are confident in the alignment, we can then project that label onto Greco. And then we can also combine this approach with some semi-supervised approaches that take advantage of monolingual data that basically when you have a tagger, you can make sure to get good likelihoods over the unannotated data. This is a fairly standard semi-supervised approach. And then when you do this, we ended up with a parse tagger that doing both of these things worked better. We're able to get a fairly decent 73% accuracy. It's not, amazing to get started with, but that was with very, very, very few annotated data by hand. We had like 100 sentences just annotated by hand. The interesting part comes when we put the linguist in the loop, and I want to show you what happens when, rather than doing all of your annotation from the very beginning, you actually get a little bit of data, get the best model you can, and you basically follow this process. You can try and build the best tagger that you can. And as long as it's not junk, it can be very useful. You can train your best tagger with cross-lingual projections, with semi-supervised approaches or whatever. And then you can tag some data. You can show them to the linguist so that they can correct that output. And then that corrected output, you can then add back to your training and then retrain your tagger again and again as you get more annotations. But now the quality of the tagger will keep improving, as I'm showing you here, from 72% all the way to 94% at the end. So in the end, we did this study also by counting the amount of time that the linguists spent correcting, normalized by length and so on and so forth. And in the end, the problem that we had was that we weren't sure if the linguist would catch all of the errors, because at this point, the tagger was so good, it was easy for the linguist to overlook an error. So of course, in this case, we had two linguists looking one on the output of the other and so on and so forth. So we're sure on the taggings that we produced up to here, but I wanted to show you how quickly, with a little bit of annotations, just 10 sentences, 20 sentences in each step, and then retraining the tagger, we were able to quickly ramp up the quality of the tagger so that the linguist had to correct fewer and fewer data as we go. However, the last thing I want to highlight about Grico is that even though I've been working on this thing since my undergrad, right? We did some data collection during my undergrad. Then during my PhD, I built this part-of-speech tagger that I showed you. I very recently, the past 2 months, started working with activists in the community. So these activists are working to revitalize the language. They are organizing week-long summer schools taking place in the villages where Grico is still spoken, and they are bringing together the elders of they have collected all of the materials they could find. They have collected corpora. They have when they do this summer school, they bring native speakers, basically their grandparents, if I'm being completely honest. They bring the grandparents to these to teach the younger generation in these week-long events. And again, organically out of this, they realized, oh no, all of the materials that we have, because some of them come from a century ago, some of them, someone just decided to write down folk tales, and someone else just created a lexicon. And there's also these linguists from Greece that have created some part-of-speech taggers and whatever. All of these were disjoint again. So we had different orthographies again, especially diachronically. So the orthography used by the community 100 years ago is very different than one that's used now. I'm not going to show you examples, especially since we're low on time. But again, that group over the past summer came up with a standardization of the alphabets. It was again the one that made sense to the speakers, to the not necessarily the instructors, but the older folks and the instructors that were trying to teach the language. And they are putting it forth now. They're trying to convert again all of their materials into that standardization of the orthography so that they can use it again for in-classroom instruction. So to wrap up, and this is all I have to say, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but even if one person hears this, it's important. For me, coming from a computer science perspective, I very naively started with the tech solutionism approach of just give me data and we'll figure it out. And we're going to build models and you can use them and blah, blah, blah. And that was, I'm proud to say that was just years ago. That's not who I am now. But I want to highlight that the common threads between all of these three case studies that I showed you, which is that there's already a ton of work, and I guarantee you that this will be the case in any community that you go into. These people care about their language. They are gonna be people who, have been mocked, and this is a true story, by their wives for years for building up lexicons or for collecting data. And then suddenly someone like me shows up and the guy takes us to their house to show us and to tell his wife that what he has been doing for the past 20 years is not a lost effort. It's something that someone takes notice, and it will be useful for the community. And I also want to highlight that modern techniques like cross-lingual transfer, projections to translations, using multilingual models potentially, and so on, allows us to build fairly good systems with very, very minimal requirements, right? Like annotating 100 sentences is a few days work. So at that point, we can build a decent system. And if we put it in the hands and we have a nice interface for the linguists or for the people doing the annotation or for the people trying to do something with their language, then we'll have a lot more impact and then speed up the annotation process and end up with a lot more tools for the community, really, and a lot more annotations for us to keep doing our research. So with that, I also want to point out that the similarities between all three was the need, but I'm not sure about the need for standardization. I'm not the one to push for necessarily a standardized orthography. If the communities are fine and happy using 3 different versions of the alphabet and everybody understands, then it's up to us to build systems that can handle that. We shouldn't force standardization, but if the community decides that that's something that they want, then sure, go ahead. And then I want to highlight that all of these works that I showed you here basically use basic NLP tools, right? We're not necessarily using transformer models or BERT or whatever. But these are the basic tools that give you good accuracy. They're easy to show, easy to deploy, and they can be still very, very, very useful in the field. So with that, I'll just highlight I guess the institutions that I've collaborated with, from Ioannina to Barcelona to the Universidad de Chile in Chile for the Mapudungun community, or the Greek folks that I'm working with. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions or open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the really optimistic talk. And well, given the agenda, we could probably be ran out of time for questions. Feel free to ask them either now or later in the sidelines. I believe that using the Zoom chat could work as well. So yeah, please go on if you have to, and if you have to run, yeah, also feel free to.
Great.
Thank you
very
so
much
much
for having me.
I just wanted to point out, with respect to your last point about orthographies and transliteration, that's one of the beautiful things about the work that we do, is that it's relatively trivial to build, as long as you've got orthographies that you can losslessly convert between, which isn't always the case, but it's relatively trivial to produce tools that the user can choose which orthography they want.
I absolutely agree. If only we could also publish those very trivial things, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. I'm not one to complain, but yeah.
No, that's a really important point. I mean, and Stephen, if you're still here, I don't know if you have any comments on this, but like that, I think that's a really important point that goes beyond just what we have time to talk about right now, is the fact that the most impactful work that we can do and that we do is usually the work that is least respected by our professional publication norms. And that's a problem. I don't have a solution, but it's a problem.
Yeah, I don't have a solution either. The last year's ACL had this very nice special theme that I think a lot of us doing this type of work I know published there and put this in the rest of the community. And I think it's opening up. There's a lot more people now doing this type of work than they were, I think, a few years ago. And I hope that this will keep increasing because people see the impact, right? And I think a lot of students also like this. They like building something that they can put back into the community. So
I mean,
yeah, of course, a ton of work to do still.
I mean, that paper that I mentioned before, the transliteration based on making it orthographically transparent. I mean, that I did publish, but it was in language documentation and conservation, not in an ACL venue.
Right. So that's the other thing, kind of like bringing the different communities together. Maybe I should take the chance to also highlight the Compute-EL workshop that I know a lot of you might already know about it, but that's the SIG EL, for the special interest groups on endangered languages, the ACL's group on that. It basically tries to do that, bring the documentary linguistics community and the indigenous communities and the computer scientists all in the same room. So this year it's online, co-located online with ICLDC, and I believe the call for papers is out. Especially if you're working with communities, you should take a look and try to submit something, because there's some also a special theme for Compute-EL this year related to justice through language technology. So highly recommend taking a look at that as another possible venue. All right, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for having me. I think yeah.